Prior, unmute yourself.
Okay, there. I'd like to thank the Center for Sustainable Communities for co-hosting this event with the Community Economies Research Network Asia Node. In particular, I'm grateful to Ann Hill, Kat McKinnon, Bhavya Chitranshi, and Shang Fuentes for co-organizing this panel. To say that the year 2020 was a tough year for teaching and learning is an utmost understatement. I think many of the educators in this session will agree that teaching and learning in the new normal require a different level of dexterity, preparedness, patience, and compassion for both instructors and students or learners. And when you add a service learning component, they can get more intense. So online service learning is a pedagogical tool that enables students to put into practice learned theories, knowledge, and skills from different courses by undertaking capacity building projects with partner institutions and communities outside of the university through remote, online-based, and action research-oriented fieldwork. In my personal experience, teaching and engaging in online service learning in the first few weeks in the middle of the pandemic was both anxiety-inducing due to the complexity of the task at hand and fulfilling because of its invaluable contribution to student learning and its support for people-centered development. So online service learning in the Philippines can be stressful and overwhelming for students, faculty, and partner institutions and communities if done haphazardly. As you can see from these many reports and headlines, teaching and learning occur in a geographical space where the longest lockdowns in the world were imposed and where concerns around quarantine restrictions intersect with long-standing problems of digital divide and unequal quality learning, typhoon-related disasters, protracted international territorial dispute over the West Philippine Sea, gross corruption in the government, and impunity, among other things. However, it is also through this online service learning space that students become more attuned to the many social and economic matters of concern that service learning partners and their stakeholders continue to overcome, especially in these extraordinary times of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in one project, two groups of computer science students assisted an NGO called Kite Foundation that helps cancer-stricken kids improve their well-being through fun storytelling. Due to the pandemic, Kite staff and volunteers cannot go to the hospitals where the children are confined. So the computer science students offered to digitize and animate the storybooks that Kite uses to adapt to the challenges of the current situation. There are also two groups of sociology majors that drafted their own research proposals, which will employ quantitative analyses to understand different development concerns in partner communities. These students were concurrently enrolled in quantitative sociology, quantitative method sociology class during that time. So one group researched on cross-generational parent-child dynamics within families whose members have experienced early teenage pregnancy. Another group looked at residents of an informal settlement situated within a public cemetery and how these residents contribute to various economic and political practices in the city of Manila as sort of like a counterpoint to the kind of dispossession that they are currently facing in the middle of the pandemic. So for this ongoing quarter, one group of management engineering students have to facilitate an online marketing workshop with members of soon-to-be founded farmers cooperative in the Visayas region with the help of an NGO called Lingap Pangkabataan. So their task is to teach tech-savvy members of farming families how to use Facebook Marketplace to directly connect them and sell their products to buyers. And another group will facilitate online tutorials with Credit Cooperative, whose employees currently record financial transactions using manual ledgers, and they're having difficulty managing that kind of database. So students will create a prototype of online database management system using Google Forms and train the employees, the cooperative employee partners on how to use this digital tool. So through this online service project, students begin to care more about the concerns of their partner institutions and communities and become more motivated to help address them through their small and short-term socio-technical interventions. So framed within this broad matters of concern, I will share in the next few minutes the context as to how I got involved in the online service program, and by giving an overview of the course that I teach, SOCSI 13, and then I'll end the presentation by sharing some of my early reflections with regard to this kind of online service learning engagement. So my involvement in the online service learning component or program in the Ateneo de Manila is through the course called the Economy, Society, and Sustainable Development, or SOCSI 13. So it is a course that aims to deepen students' understanding of processes of economic and social development and their knowledge of concepts and skills that can address different development issues in the Philippines, including poverty, exclusion, inequality, and vulnerability. So it also draws on the concept of sustainable development as framework for analyzing and addressing all those development issues in ways that are socially just and environmentally sustainable. So it is offered and coordinated by the economics department. However, it is taught in partnership with the sociology and anthropology department where I am currently affiliated. The course contains 5 modules, including problems, parameters, paradigms, policies, and practices. And that last part on practices particularly focuses on the online service learning component of the course. So to help lighten the students being too overwhelmed by the complexity of what they will do, and also due to to ease the burden from of pandemic related anxiety and feeling overzoomed in the process. So faculty and formators have to effectively design the service learning activity that can be only accomplished within 7 to 8 weeks or within a quarter. So it is also within this quarter that they have to attend other courses and design the strategies that they will employ to deliver the service learning project. So the online engagement is typically done over 3 weekends in another class. It's the formation class handled by the Office for Social Concern and Involvement, and each session can last for 1.5 hours only. So that's really tight. And students can schedule additional online field sessions during weekdays and can text or email representatives from service learning partners for any emerging concerns and inquiries. So by finals week, by the end of the quarter, students have to submit a final integrated report, which includes a theoretical framing and analysis of the development issues that the project has tried to address. So that primarily applies, what they've learned in the course that I teach. And also they include a project documentation and a reflection of their own learning from the project. So the less is actually more and better in terms of the amount of service learning project activities and deliverables that can be done by students given that kind of tight schedule that they have to follow. So this is the end of the presentation. So it is through the online service learning that learners are envisioned to nurture 2 important Jesuit values in education, magis and cura personalis. So there are many ways to interpret the Latin word magis, but one interpretation broadly refers to doing more and better for the greater glory of God. So ad majorem Dei gloriam. It should be noted that Ateneo is a Jesuit-run private university in the Philippines. And going back to Maggie's, it's not only in terms of quantity, doing more and better, but also in terms of quality. And the other value is cura personalis. So it's a Latin phrase that directly translates to care for the whole person. So an example for Maggie's is when students do not only strive to get higher grades, but also to use what they have learned in classes to serve the needs of others. So hence, SOCSI 13 is also integrated in the delivery of the government-mandated National Service Training Program, or NSTP, that is intended to promote civic consciousness among them. And the literacy training and civil welfare training are sort of like sub program components of that particular policy in the Philippines. And at the Ateneo, the literacy training and civic welfare training programs are creatively reimagined as a series of formation journeys that are based on planting or gardening. So as you can see from that, the figure on the right-hand side, binhi is called seed, punla is seedling with roots developing, and bigkis or bundled harvest like a sheaf of rice grains. So each formation journey is facilitated by Ateneo formators and corresponds to a particular academic course and a specific teaching and learning strategy. So for SOCSI 13, it is taught to students who are also taking NSTP Big Keys or the action-oriented kilos to act formation program. An example that illustrates cura personalis is when students do not only harness their intellectual capacity, but also make sure that their emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical well-being is thriving. So to help contribute to students' development of cura personalis, SOCSI 13, the partner major course, and the formators only require one and the same final integrated output for each project. So the final integrated output constitutes already 30% of the total grade for SOCSI 13. So to end, it is in this interdisciplinary Jesuit value formative and civic consciousness raising milieu that students get to participate in online service learning projects for social and economic transformation. Through this online service learning projects, a space for learning based on hope and optimism, and not just about the typical Rostowian trajectory of development is realized. So they get to develop early on an advocacy for addressing development issues using the knowledge, skills, and attitude that they have gathered and nurtured through the different integrated courses. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Priya, and a lot of food for thought there about models that we could potentially apply in different contexts. So thank you. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat space because we're going to move straight to Bhavya. And Bhavya is a PhD fellow at the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney, although she's joining us today from India. And she's co-founder of an Adivasi Indigenous Single Women's Collective. And she's going to be talking to us today a little bit about some of the action research that she's been doing with colleagues there. So Bhavya, wonderful to have you here with us, and over to you.
Thank you, Anne. I would like to start with thanking Priya and Anne for sharing this platform and organizing this. I wasn't sure until day before yesterday if I would be able to join, but I don't know, something happened. I was just looking through some pictures if I should put them together, and then I thought that it would be a good opportunity to be part of this and be able to talk to you all and have a conversation. So I will share the screen in a bit. Yeah. So I'm simply sharing today some questions vis-a-vis action research that I've been struggling with since the start of this pandemic. What does action research really mean in the times of COVID-19? How have the meanings of action and research changed in the context of this pandemic? What is happening to the relationship between co-action researchers as a result of physical distancing? Has this changed the idea of transformative praxis in general? How do we think through changing meanings of community-based work, collective action, and commoning when faced with conditions of a pandemic? Action research for me is largely about the embodied, affective, sensorial, and psychosocial experiences. How do we bring about these experiences in online or virtual research settings as we fast move towards online research today? And what about what about action research with communities where technology and digital platforms have yet not reached in the ways available to us? In the single women's group in India that I work with, only 3 women out of the total 40 in the group have phones. And only 1 out of them has a smartphone with internet facility. I speak to Mami Didi and at times other women around her through this phone. We do video calls sometimes, but the network in the village is not stable to carry undisrupted video calls. So I rarely get to see them anymore. Doing online research in this context is just out of question. Some very old women cannot see or hear properly. It is extremely difficult for them to communicate over phone. We communicate when they touch my face, hold my hand, and talk slowly as I sit close to them and lean in to listen. I'll just share some pictures. A bit of a narcissist exercise because a lot of pictures are of my own. So physical touch, warm hugs, holding hands, lying next to each other, late night conversations, long walks in groups, working together in the field, and being immersed in the process of research is what this pandemic has taken away from me. It has led to the loss of how we used to be together at ENS. More than quote unquote research, I miss hanging out with my group, doing what in those moments seemed like nothing, not much at least. I miss the dancing, the teasing, being taught simple things like tying my hair in a bun, to cook on firewood, to bathe in the open, to plant rice, to live in the village, to embrace one's womanhood and singleness. And most importantly, to love, to relate. Is this research? I think yes. And it feels scary to think that I might not be able to do this, to learn more of this, to get to be around my friends and co-researchers for a long time to come. How does one even learn farming without being in the farm? How does one learn commoning without being in a collective space? How does one learn to love without being in relationships? Do long distance relationships work? I've been in many and still single, so I highly doubt. A lot happens outside planned methods and agendas with which we go to the field. I remember how we had formed DNS in 2013. It was not part of our plan to begin with. Women used to sit together in the evenings and I used to join in. We would talk to each other about our lives, random conversations, mostly gossip. Sometimes they would burst into laughter, and at other times, usual banter would lead to someone crying and others consoling them. Most of these conversations, happy or sad, used to be around their experience of singleness, and that is how we began working on the issue. Similarly, the idea of doing sustainable collective farming also emerged with Aya sharing her dream in one such setting, and it just took off from there. I feel my work as an action researcher is not limited to organizing or facilitating one project. It is equally important for me to also be immersed in the life world that already exists therein. It seems crucial to be able to respond to spontaneous processes that come our way. I wonder if distant research would ever allow for this kind of place-based spontaneity. I barely met ENS in my last visit to Raigada in 2020. Soon after reaching there, the national lockdown was announced and I was stuck at home for 3 months straight. When the lockdown eased, I could travel to the village, but by the time we had to head straight to working in the farms as the agriculture season had started. Most of our discussions that were supposed to be FGDs happened in these fields while we worked in the farm. We faced a lot of trouble procuring traditional seed varieties because the local preserved seeds were consumed during the period of the lockdown. But we persevered and completed the sowing process collectively. Unfortunately, after this, I had to return to Delhi because my parents had contracted COVID. I could not go back to Raigada at the time of harvest, and I remember on the last day of the harvest, I got an early morning phone call. I saw a big fat frog in the paddy field on the screen and heard a huge laughter in the background. Then Mami Didi turned the camera towards her and the other women working there and said, "We were harvesting the last plot, and Mala Didi spotted this frog and screamed, 'See, Bhavya has come to be with us today. Doesn't she look exactly like her?' And we all laughed again, harder this time. I remember how I cried after keeping the phone down. I could see that I was being missed too. I know it is cheesy, but this is my favorite COVID story so far. These are all pictures that the women sent to me when I was away from the field. It is actually quite difficult to explain how much extra effort they took during this time to keep me in the loop throughout the process because I could not be with them. This is from January 2021, when I went back to the field and we had already done harvesting. This was time for distribution. And we of the produce, the finger millets and the rice, as you can see. And we had planned a lot of workshops and FGDs that we had missed during the lockdown last year. The situation seemed under control. Most bans had lifted and we were recording lesser number of cases compared to the year earlier. It was beginning of the lean period in agriculture cycles. So it seemed like a good time to continue the research now. But it was a matter of time till we hit the second strain. And from then on, it has been a national disaster. Death, loss, the struggle to survive each day stares us hard in the face today. It feels like we are literally living in a war zone. Nothing makes sense anymore. Given this, one wonders, what does it mean to do action research in these strange times? How a pandemic generated suffering, grief, fear, and anxiety, reshaping our fantasy, desire, and subjective being. The pandemic seems like a moment of pause, a break from ways of the world we used to inhabit, a break from earlier understandings of research organized around bettering life. Life is itself at loss today. How do we make space for this loss in our thinking forward from now on? Sitting far away from my friends in the field, perhaps one is left with researching oneself, trying to reach to the corners of one's inner self, revisiting one's own sense of singleness, interpreting the difficult language of loss. The only action research seeming possible today is to try and work through this fragile and vulnerable self, to let this journey of self-transformation take its course. My hope is that this may reconnect us in a new way. It may give us a newer form and meaning to our collective existence in this changed world moving through global suffering. It may lead us to reimagine and transform the hyphenated continuum of the self-other matrix in ways that may take us to the doorstep of collective healing. I'm waiting to reconnect with ENS and the lands in Raigada again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhavya, for sharing, and it was very moving. So I'm still thinking through what you're saying, and wonderful to think about how we have to think of ourselves and our relationship with the world and being reconfigured in this time. So thank you very much for sharing such a moving experience and story. So Shang, welcome, and moving back to the Philippines and to Mindanao. And wonderful to have Shang Fuentes here with us, who's a senior lecturer in the University of the Philippines, Mindanao, has done a lot of work on gender and sexuality, among other things, and working with women in conflict vulnerable areas of Mindanao. So Shang is going to be sharing a little bit about work she's been doing with ACR, the Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research. So thank you, Shang. I've been a little bit flexible with the time. I asked you all to be about 9 minutes, but I haven't wanted to cut you off when you're in the middle of a point, but I will time you for about 9 to 10 minutes, Shang. Okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Anne. Thank you for having me here. Thank you to the Center for Sustainable Communities. Thanks to Prior for coming up with a wonderful poster. And thanks for having Bhavya as well here and the rest of the organizers. Thank you really for the opportunity to be able to share with you some of the insights I have gained well, it's a work in progress. Okay, but yeah, some of the things that I've learned in the course of doing this research, doing different sorts of researches during the pandemic, and we all know as academics, we even under very difficult times, we're still striving hard, to come up with our researches. So what I'll be sharing this morning, well, this afternoon to you there, are the researches, 3 researches that I've done. One is an offshoot, so I'll discuss the areas, methods very briefly. The challenge, I will focus more on the challenges encountered during this pandemic and how we sort of address these challenges and the recommendations I can probably provide based on the experience. So these are the researches we have conducted during this pandemic. As Anne mentioned, we are working with an ACR project, which is ending in June. Although this one that I'll be sharing is an offshoot of that research that we have been doing, because this is now focused and is coming from funding is coming from Picard DOST. It's like ACR's counterpart there in Australia. And then I'll be also sharing about our research in understanding the roles of women in violent extremism here in Mindanao. For the first research, that's an R&D research. I'm the project officer and at the same time the project leader of Mindanao there. So I'm so hands-on with that. They are more research. They are R&D as well, because they have components where capacity building and all sorts of things were being done by the NGOs engaged in that. But I wasn't involved in that. I was just involved in the research component of that. So I'm a researcher in the understanding the roles of women, and then also in measuring the level of trust among Christians, Muslims, and IT leaders in Mindanao. So for the first research, as I mentioned, it's an R&D research whose aim is to establish improved, sustainable, and resilient community-based livelihoods for the conflict vulnerable areas in the agriculture, aquatic, and natural resources sectors. Quite a mouthful, okay? So we have a total of 241 farmers. There are more females than males, and we started in 2017, and we have just ended last month for this project. And as I mentioned, it's a Picard DOST funded. The life model, or the livelihood improvement through facilitated extension model, is an agro-extension model that we're using in these areas, in different areas in Mindanao. The second one is the understanding women's roles in violent extremism. We have key informant interviews with those who were directly involved in VE, in violent extremism, and those who were indirectly involved. So we also interviewed NGOs, academics, different stakeholders, LGU officials, the security sector, the religious sector as well. So the research areas are still within Mindanao. We chose them on the basis of them having more established VE groups. There are so many VE groups in Mindanao, but there are more established ones like the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, the ISIL inspired, the Abu Sayyaf group. So they are here in Basilan, Sulu, Palembang, so different parts in Mindanao. We did the research between January 2020 and May 2020. So as you can see, lockdown started here in March 2020. So we had it during, we had an experience before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And this is funded by Asia Foundation. So the third research is an endline study on the level of trust among ITs, Muslims, and Christian leaders in Mindanao. And this one is a really tough one because we had 853 respondents. It's not easy, and we also, because of the pandemic, we made use of a software called Kobo. It's open source. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. And we conducted the research between January 2021 and June 2021. So still within Zamboanga, respondents were scattered all over the different provinces. These ones listed are the different provinces in Mindanao. The reason for this is these are the provinces where Asia Foundation did their Peace Connect project. The Peace Connect project is basically to build social cohesion and mutual trust among the different groups of people in Mindanao. So yes, there were case studies, surveys, and key informant interviews. And of course, instead of phone or social media, instead of face-to-face, we had phone or social media interviews. So we contacted them through a list from the NGOs, because it's a network of different NGOs. And we have from the interviewees, we then asked for referral for other interviews because we had treatment and control groups. So this is a really difficult part. I'll explain later. So we did online survey using the software instead of pen and paper, which most of the researchers on the field, were quite used to. But now with the online thing, it was also a learning curve for everyone. And of course, team meetings were conducted virtually instead of face-to-face, which of course in itself, provided a lot of challenges. So what were these different challenges? Yes, as we all experience, lockdowns, have been happening, especially here in the Philippines. Yes, it's one of the longest lockdowns that we have, and people are really suffering in terms of the financial aspect of it. Of course, there's also the social and the mental, emotional side of things, but really people are hard up, and unemployment has risen to 4-point-something million. And it's, they said it lowered this month to 3-point-something. Still, you've got millions of people losing their jobs, and a lot of establishments have closed shops. So when we did phone interviews, some of the challenges we encountered included phone numbers they were given by the NGOs. When you dial them, unfortunately, they are no longer functional. They're inactive. So what do? You keep on dial, or it could also be because they were not there. At that time where the people were, respondents were, there was no signal at all. But their numbers can be still functional, because another challenge is that connectivity is really a problem in a lot of these areas, highly unstable. Sometimes some of the areas purposely turned off their signal because there are operations, for example, that are being done that they try to avoid, having communication through online. And of course, as we know, it's difficult to build rapport when only one's voice can be heard. One cannot read one's body language, the expression of the interviewee. So it's really hard to deal with that when you're doing a phone interview. And of course, setting meetings as well, because most of these people are professionals. And as we know now, even if people are working from home, it's really difficult to juggle, the private and the public space basically have been meshed together, and there's no distinction really. So there's also difficulty in getting the respondents' consent, because when you ask them and you interview, if you're the enumerator, you introduce yourself, people are wary because they have been, victims of online scams. So there are so many scams or phone scams. They promise something, but then they just give details. And another incident that happened was that one of the houses that participated before in some activity got raided by the authorities. So people are really scared to join interviews. And women in VE were also afraid to be interviewed, as some of them have joined already revolutionary groups, and they were prevented from participating in the interview. Husbands or parents did not allow them to be interviewed as well, again, for fear of security. This is mainly security concern. And then translated transcripts is also one challenge, because the researchers from the field are writing them in, interviewing the people in their local language, the respondents in their local language. Now, what we get in return are translated ones, and as we all know, a lot gets lost, in translation. So that's one of the key challenges that we encountered. Okay. Another is the religious celebrations. We know that Holy Week, for Roman Catholics, some of the respondents said, "Oh, we're so busy with our church activities, we cannot accommodate you for your interviews." And for the Muslim respondents as well, they're also celebrating Ramadan. So yeah, they needed to rest. So yeah, so these are some of the challenges, and of course there are armed clashes. So these are the problems. So if you have local researchers who can actually go to the area, but the trouble is, there are armed clashes between the government and some group that they are chasing. So yeah, there are so many clashes happening. In fact, just 2 days ago, in Maguindanao, there's a clash there, and civilians have also been a part of the victims. As it usually happens. And one of the key problems is the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, which was passed last 3rd of July 2020. Notice that this was passed during the pandemic. So people are scared, because at the moment, this particular law is being heard at the Supreme Court. There are oral arguments happening. It was the 7th session yesterday, wherein they are hearing the different sides, because there are 37, I think, petitioners against this law, because of course, as we know, at the moment, there are so many peasant leaders, indigenous peoples, activists, basically dissidents, anyone who's anti-government are being, not just persecuted, being killed. There are summary executions. There's even the Bloody Sunday that they've labeled it the Bloody Sunday, because in one day, so many people activists were killed. So strategies, yeah. So because we have all these challenges that we encountered, as a research team, we came up with different strategies. Like, first, there really has to be an orientation with enumerators and field researchers, because you are not there with them in the field, so you have to make sure that we are always following research, basic research protocols. And of course, we have to include the COVID-19 protocols for those who are doing the interviews face-to-face. Then we need to pre-test the questionnaire, test the data collection tool if using one. So this is where the problem lies. Some people who are not techie, for example, had a really difficult time learning the instrument. So sometimes we just shifted to like an email kind of tool. You just email, so they will say, can we just email it via Word, and then you will answer. So sometimes it happens like that. So you have to be flexible. And you need to simulate as well the interviews to see how long it lasts and how they manage to do that. And again, as a research team, you have to be clear at the onset, the financial and administrative concerns, like how much is going to be paid for this, how, what's the amount allocated for it, so that it's clear, in the beginning, everyone's clear about that. And of course, these are done regularly as well. There are regular meetings. It's not just an orientation. And we also devise strategies like having field coordinators. So aside from your local enumerators, you have an overall supervision coming from the field coordinators, because these are large areas, so provinces that are covered. So we had to have that. And yes, within the research team, we also do regular monitoring. How are the protocols? Because regional, local, national protocols can change rather quickly. And so we also have local close coordination with government agencies.
Chang, I'm just going to cut in because of the time.
Sure.
I'm sorry I was trying to send you a message before, but thinking you might not be hearing. But would you make one last comment, and then perhaps you can weave some of your comments into the discussion?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure, Anne. Okay. So yeah, so we need to make certain strategies, and we need to be flexible, and we need to be patient, and we need to maximize also the social media platforms that we have. And finally, yes, we need to protect the health and security of our team members, including anonymity of team members, because they should never be identified as the ones who have links with people who are engaged, for example, in violent extremism. And that finally, we need to recognize that, these are really difficult times, and we are all works in progress, but we can be very patient, flexible, and optimistic. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Shang, and to all of our speakers. I'm just going to thank you, Shang.
I'll just stop sharing.
Great. So you may like to turn on your video if you're in a position to do so. And we really only have sort of 12 minutes left for many of us who've got to continue on with other aspects of our day. But I just wanted to open it up for reflections or questions, or just any thoughts that you might have, really. Very moving talks, and lots of things that I'm still thinking about. So I wondered if anyone would like to share some reflections or thoughts based on those three presentations.
So, Bhavya, do you think your research project is going to look anything like the research project that you envisaged at the start, or is this going to be really a complete reorientation and reframing? I mean, what I'm getting from what you said is that, the embodiment, the affect, the sensorial journey is part of the action research. So this is a whole new process of embodiment and affect that you are saying you have to let run its course. Do you foresee an action research project that looks anything like what you envisaged before COVID?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the action bit of it, also because the PhD is just part of this long project that has been going on for a very long time. And by this time, this was the 4th year of our agriculture, like engaging in collective agriculture. So even if I was not in the field, the action bit of it, so quote unquote action bit of it, happened in terms of, like planting the seeds, harvesting. Now we have the produce and everything, and we've distributed it and stuff. So the work has definitely happened, and it has happened in a very different way, which is in itself very reflective. Like how did women take charge of processes that I used to participate in earlier. So it's a different the research bit of it has changed because of COVID, but there are quite a lot of insights and different kinds of experiences that have also emerged from this. And and I think you're absolutely right about how the sensoriality of it, the embodiment of it, the psychosocial experiences of it have been very different in this 1 year. Because I think in the last 8 years, I'm personally realizing that I was so focused on everything external, on building the Sangathan, on being with the women, on learning to be in the village, etc., that a lot of self-reflection was always, secondary, which is also very important. So it is happening in this phase of PhD work. So yeah, I mean, writing all of it would be a different ballgame altogether. But it's interesting. I mean, apart from all the longing and stuff.
Mary, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I'm somewhat an outsider insider here, but my entry is because Pryor and I were together in one of those courses. So it was my privilege to be with him as he was developing all of this. Let me just ask maybe Prior and the other two. I'm also faculty in social anthropology, and I'm trying to bring together the academic world and the NGO community people world. What I find, there's a lot of gray literature in NGO newsletters about what's happening in communities, but I don't see much of the research being done with communities now, action research especially, coming out in the literature. So for the policymakers, they can't rely on much from the academic sector to guide them. So I wondered whether you, as active people on the ground, but also linked to academe, have a way of bringing those experiences to a larger perspective in which the idea of promoting community approaches and solutions on their own is also part of the larger social analysis of tremendous changes that are happening in our countries. So that's my question.
Thank you, Mary, for that wonderful question. I think this is really, the kind of privilege that I get by being part of the Community Economies Institute and Community Economies Research Network. And many of the works that the people from these organizations do is to really float and come up with inventories of all of these diverse economic and ecological livelihoods of people, including particularly the works of communities in partnership with non-government organizations. And it's available actually, especially with the work the newly published book edited by Professor Catherine Gibson and Kelly Dombrowski, the Handbook of Diverse Economies, that really give a broad perspective of all of these kinds of engagement. And the Community Economies Research Network, or Community Economies website also provides a good list of materials that have these kinds of engagements.
So thank you, Prior. We've got Stephen, I think, was next, and then Catherine Gibson. Thanks, Stephen. Unmute.
Yep, sorry, and I'll lower my hand too. Thanks all three of you for those really great talks. And I don't know if this is, and for that provocative question that was just asked by Mary there. I don't know if this is a good answer, probably not, but several of us are getting together tomorrow to discuss the work of Elizabeth Barron, who's in between diverse economies research and ecology. In particular, she studied fungus and the gathering of non-traditional timber forest products. Anyway, she came up with this framework for thinking about it, centered on 4 words that's supposed to facilitate conversations between scientists and social scientists. And the words were displacement, misplacement, replacement, and emplacement. And in the piece that I was reading, she focused in particular on emplacement as this ability to kind of specify the ecological and economic circumstances that we find ourselves in. So for me, action research is really about specifying the context. And then really, as we tell more and more stories about particular places, an alternative to the one world, as John Law puts it, begins to emerge, right? So the action research is the intervention, and it is the way of shifting how academics communicate with the rest of the world. But now for the point that I wanted to make, emplacement, the way that Elizabeth Zah defines it, is she says it's unique or singular, the singularity of our being. That's what we find when we do the research that Bhavya was describing, I think. And its singular is still there, even if we find ourselves either displaced or misplaced, and it's probably both. But one suggestion I have is that though both those pieces where she talks about this emplacement concept is on the Community Economies website that Priya just mentioned. And I'm still thinking about it, just like I'm gonna be thinking about these 3 talks. So thanks again.
Yeah, there's something very interesting. It reminded me of a quote that you, Catherine Gibson, have used, and I can't remember where it came from, but I think that whole delicate relationship between the self and the world, and the way in which, you know, those two are inextricably linked in terms of making the world and making ourselves, and it being a reciprocal relationship. But Catherine, I think you have a question or a comment too.
Well, it was just a comment, really. And first of all, it's fantastic to have these 3 different presentations. I think this is the beginning of, you know, hopefully many more of these kinds of sharing, because I think in order to answer Mary's question, we probably need to do more reflection on the kind of work we're doing and write it up more. I think, you know, action research is something that is still, to some extent, a minor voice within academia. There are journals of action research and there's a handbook, but it's still something that's very difficult to get through ethics approvals at universities and so that sort of thing. So it's still not as recognised perhaps in the academic world as legitimate as other kinds of social science. And yet, of course, in development literature and so on, it's being used all the time. And I've just been doing workshops with a lot of artists who are actually doing action research as art practice all over the world. And of course, they don't have to go through ethics departments and so on like that, but they're actually doing very similar work than the kind of work we've been doing over the years. So I think there is probably a call for a bigger statement on the part of the research, the sort of research we're all doing, for its validity as an academic kind of enterprise. And, you know, there are definitely works that say that, but it's probably a good call, Mary, for us all to be thinking about how we write this up and maybe as more than just one particular study, but actually start to put a few together across different contexts so we can actually show how this kind of method really can have a big impact in a way that's ubiquitous but very in place, as Stephen was saying, and that is a form of global scale. You know, it's like a reframing of what we mean by a global scale, which Julie and I talked about, but I think it could be demonstrated a lot more. But this is just a great beginning to that kind of conversation, and I really thank Anne and Priya for activating the Asia wing of the CERN network. It's just fantastic to see this happening. So thanks.
Wonderful. And I am looking to see if anyone else has questions, but also wonder if our 3 speakers today have any more reflections or things they want to add that they didn't get to say when they were speaking.
Maybe I can just add a bit, Anne, on what Mary mentioned about research, no, and NGOs, the academia. This kind of collaboration is indeed really lacking. So we are really working towards and really to have the communities themselves become authors, no, of their own stories. We really look forward to that, because it's always the case that. But anyway, we have. In our project, we have slowly, tried to do that but it's not in the community itself, but it's more with our facilitators that we have trained to become as well researchers, and the farmers have become scientists as well, as they experiment and do recordings and all that. So it's a very participatory kind of collaboration, and the NGO really helps in facilitating this, while the local government unit takes on their role in providing, for example, the assistance. Anyway, they're mandated in the first place to do that, so they do that, they provide assistance, and the data we get, they then feed into their programs and projects. So I think it's slowly getting there, but it's too far, Mary. It's still too far from what we really envision. But there are small steps that we're taking towards that direction.
Thank you, Shane. Mary, would you like to respond? And I think Joe Caffrey, you might have your hand up. Just let me know if that's still the case, Joe.
Just quickly, that out of all of this, I'm hoping that we can build a stronger theory base. I keep saying theory comes from below, quote unquote, from empirical evidence. And if we can bring some of this into the social theory world of social change, that's what I'm hoping will happen from all of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And conversation to be continued. And I think, Joe, feel free to make your comments. Thanks.
I just wanted to comment on, I apologize now for saying that incorrectly, but Bahavia's presentation, all three were fantastic, but I thought Bahavia reminded us of the importance of relationships, of the human inside our projects, and how important that is to not only gain deep data and research, but to form relationships to help build capacity within these countries, within our projects. So I just wanted to say how important that was, and thank you for reminding us of that.
Yeah, and I think I was very moved by that, Bhavya, because of the collective, the sense of collective identity. And I think when some of us are suffering, many of us are suffering alongside, you know, and I think there's a lot of power in thinking of ourselves as collective beings, and that we're sharing in each other's journey. So, you know, I think to bring this session to a close is to invite us to think about how we might continue in these discussions and in this community of practice, and in our efforts to support one another in our work. And, you know, so if you have any thoughts on how you might like to contribute to a subsequent session for the CERN Asia network, but also the community of practice that Catherine McKinnon and I and others here in the Centre for Sustainable Communities have been looking to foster during COVID time. So there's a cross-pollination here between you know, our interest in online connection, but also in growing the CERN Asia network. So please email me or Prior if you have any thoughts on future topics. We're looking to run a session for CERN Asia every couple of months, 2 to 3 months realistically, in the current context and in this sort of format. And we welcome your suggestions and input. So I'm kind of going to officially close the session, and thank you all for joining us today and for giving of your time, and particularly to our 3 speakers for sharing so personally about your work and your current struggles with that work. So thank you very much to our presenters and for all of you for being here. And if anyone of the presenters want to stay on for a moment, feel free. Otherwise, I will close the session and look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.
Great. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Prior, meanwhile, we could stay on if it's free to stay on.
Stay in the room.
Yeah.